The year turned in Lochdu with the muted cheer of a village that preferred its celebrations modest and its troubles private. Hogmanay had come and gone under a sky the colour of wet slate, leaving behind empty bottles, fading laughter, and a silence that felt heavier than usual. It was that silence that first drew attention to the small white cottage at the edge of the moor, a place most people passed without a second glance. By mid-morning on New Year's Day, smoke should have been curling from the chimney. It never did. Mrs. Mac Ray, walking her dog along the frozen track, was the first to notice. She knocked once, then twice, and finally tried the door. It opened easily, swinging inward with a soft creak. The dog refused to cross the threshold, whining low in its throat. Mrs. Mac Ray saw enough in that moment to step back and shout for help. Inside, the cottage was immaculate, almost unnaturally so. The table had been laid for one, a single place setting untouched, a glass of whiskey poured but never drunk. The fire in the hearth had burned down to cold ash hours earlier, and in the centre of the sitting room, seated upright in a wooden chair, was Angus Mac Leod. He looked as though he were resting. His eyes were closed, his hands folded neatly in his lap. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. The only thing out of place was the faint bluish tinge to his lips and fingertips, and the fact that Angus Mac Leod was very clearly dead. By the time Hamish Macbeth arrived, the cottage was crowded with concerned villagers and one increasingly flustered constable from a neighbouring town. Hamish took it all in quietly, his pale eyes moving from face to face, from the frost clinging to boots on the floor to the sealed windows and the firmly locked back door. Locked from the inside, the constable said, eager to sound competent. No sign of forced entry. Doctor says heart failure, most likely. Man lived alone, after all. Hamish said nothing. He crouched by the chair, close enough to smell the cold air trapped in the room. Angus Mac Leod had been 72, fit enough to walk the hills most days, and stubborn enough to ignore doctors entirely. A heart attack was possible. Too possible. Hamish had learned long ago that the neatest answers were often the most dangerous. He noticed the clock on the mantelpiece, stopped at exactly 12 minutes past midnight. It had not been smashed or tampered with. It had simply stopped. Beside it lay a small scrap of paper, folded once, blank on both sides. Hamish picked it up, turning it between his fingers. "What's that, then?" someone asked. "Nothing," Hamish said mildly, which only made a few people uneasy. The doctor confirmed there were no obvious injuries. No poison was detected on the lips or in the glass of whiskey, though it had not yet been tested properly. Angus had died some time after midnight, alone, seated as though waiting for something, or someone. Outside, the snow around the cottage was pristine, unmarked by footprints other than those of Mrs. Mac Ray and her dog. Hamish stepped outside, breathing in the sharp, clean air. The moor stretched away in pale silence. Whoever had come to Angus Mac Leod's cottage, if anyone had come at all, had left no trace behind, or perhaps they had never truly entered. Back inside, Hamish studied the New Year decorations still pinned to the wall, a faded paper banner, a sprig of holly above the door. Angus had not been a festive man. He disliked company and rarely marked the holidays. Yet the table had been set carefully, the whiskey poured fresh. Angus had been expecting a visitor. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet certainty that this was no simple death. A locked room, a body with no wounds, a clock stopped at midnight, and a blank note that said nothing at all. Too many small, deliberate details. Too much silence. As the villagers whispered and speculated, Hamish Macbeth stood in the doorway of the cottage, looking back at the still figure in the chair. Whatever had happened here had been planned with care, and whoever the silent New Year visitor was, they had come and gone without a sound. And Hamish knew, with the uncomfortable clarity that never failed him, that this case was only just beginning. Hamish stayed longer than was strictly necessary, long after the doctor had finished, and the constable had begun ushering people out with nervous authority. He leaned against the doorframe, seemingly idle, while his eyes worked steadily, catching what others dismissed as the ordinary clutter of a solitary man's life. The first thing that troubled him was the air. The cottage smelled faintly of peat smoke and cold stone, but beneath it lingered something sharper, almost metallic, like frost biting bare skin. He bent near the hearth, brushing the ash gently with his fingers. The fire had burned clean and hot, recently tended, yet Angus had died sitting several feet away. People did not usually build up a fire only to let it die while they waited, unless they expected company and wished the room warm when that person arrived. Hamish crossed to the table. The glass of whisky was full to the brim, poured with care. Too much care. Most men Angus's age poured generously but never precisely. Hamish lifted the glass and sniffed. Nothing obvious. Still, he set it back exactly where it had been, noting a faint ring of moisture beneath it, as if it had been poured some time before midnight and left untouched. "Anyone see Angus last night?" Hamish asked casually. A few villagers exchanged looks. Finally, Morag Mac Innes spoke up. "I saw his light on around 11. Thought it odd, mind you. He usually turned in early. Anyone visit him?" Hamish pressed. There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "No," Morag said. "Not that I saw." Hamish smiled faintly and moved on, as though satisfied. He was not. He had noticed Morag's eyes flick briefly toward the window when she answered, toward the narrow track that wound across the moor. Outside, the constable was busy making notes, his breath puffing white in the cold. "No signs of foul play," he said when Hamish joined him. "Sad, but simple." "Simple things often aren't," Hamish replied mildly. He walked the perimeter of the cottage, careful to place his feet only where others had already trodden. The snow was thin in places, scoured by wind, but near the back wall it lay smooth and untouched, except for one thing. Near the window, barely visible unless the light struck it just so, was a faint indentation, not a footprint but the suggestion of one, as though someone had stood there briefly and then shifted their weight. Hamish crouched, studying it. Whoever had stood there wore soft-soled shoes, not boots. Indoor shoes, slippers perhaps. Inside again, Hamish's attention drifted to the clock on the mantelpiece. Stopped clocks were common enough, but this one had been well cared for, recently wound. He opened the back carefully. Nothing broken. He set it ticking again with a gentle touch. The sound felt loud in the silent room, like a heartbeat returning too late. His gaze fell once more on the scrap of paper. He unfolded it again, holding it up to the light. Blank, yes, but not clean. There was a faint indentation, the ghost of writing pressed into the fibres. Someone had written something, then removed the paper above it. Hamish could not read the message, but he could feel its presence, an absence that spoke louder than words. When he straightened, he caught sight of Mrs. Macrae standing by the door, wringing her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes darting anywhere but at Angus's body. "You all right?" Hamish asked gently. "Aye," she said too quickly. "Just a shock, that's all." "Did Angus expect visitors often?" Hamish asked. Mrs. Macrae hesitated. "Not often," she said. "But, well, Hogmanay is Hogmanay." Hamish nodded, as if that explained everything. He noticed then the smallest thing of all, a smear of melted snow just inside the threshold, already beginning to dry. It had been stepped on and partially wiped away, as though someone had entered briefly and left again. No forced entry, no obvious visitor, and yet signs of waiting, signs of arrival, signs of something carefully concealed. As the constable finally closed his notebook and declared the matter all but settled, Hamish Macbeth looked once more at Angus MacLeod in his chair, at the peaceful face that hid an untold ending. Someone in Loch Dhu knew more than they were saying. Someone had come on New Year's night and left nothing behind but silence, and Hamish, with his keen eye and patient mind, had begun to see the shape of the lie forming beneath the snow. Hamish let the constable finish his work and leave before he began asking questions in earnest. Routine had its place, but it also made people careless. Once the cottage was quiet again and Angus MacLeod had been taken away, Hamish moved through the village at an unhurried pace, stopping where people naturally gathered on New Year's Day, by the shop near the post office, outside the pub where last night's cheer still clung to the air. He began with Morag Mac Innes, catching her as she locked up the shop. She greeted him with a smile that was just a little too bright. "You said you saw Angus's light on around 11, Hamish said conversationally. "What were you doing out so late?" Morag shrugged. "Counting stock. Hogmanay always leaves a mess, and after 11? "I went straight home," she said. "Didn't see a soul." Hamish nodded, as though making a mental note. "Funny thing," he added gently. "Your house faces the back of Angus's cottage. You'd have had a clear view of the track." Morag's smile wavered. "Well, I wasn't watching it," she said, a touch too sharply. "People have their own business." Hamish let her go, the faint tension in her voice lingering with him. He moved on to the pub, where two men nursed late-morning drams and talked too loudly about nothing at all. One of them, Donald Fraser, had been at the Hogmanay gathering the night before. "Good turnout," Hamish said. "Aye," Donald replied. "Angus didn't come, though. Said he had plans." "Plans?" Hamish echoed. Donald frowned. "That's what he said. I thought it odd, truth be told. He never had plans. And did he say who with?" "No," Donald said quickly. "Didn't ask." Hamish studied him for a moment. Donald took a long swallow of whisky, avoiding his gaze. Too quick an answer. Too neat. At Mrs. Mac Ray's cottage, the woman hovered nervously as Hamish asked his questions. She repeated her discovery of the body word for word, but when Hamish asked about the night before, her story shifted slightly. "I heard footsteps," she said, then corrected herself. "Or maybe the wind. It was blowing something fierce." "Which way?" Hamish asked. "From the moor," she said, though the night had been still. Hamish thanked her and stepped back outside, the pieces beginning to rub against one another in his mind. No one had seen a visitor, yet several people had noticed things they could not quite explain. A light on late, plans made but never shared, footsteps that were not footsteps at all. In the afternoon, Hamish paid a visit to Ewan Campbell, Angus's nearest neighbour, a man known for keeping to himself and knowing more than he admitted. Ewan welcomed him in stiffly, his eyes flicking toward the door as though expecting someone else. "Did you see Angus last night?" Hamish asked. Ewan shook his head. "No." "Did anyone visit him?" "No." Hamish let the silence stretch. Ewan shifted uncomfortably. "You were at home all night?" Hamish asked. "Aye," Ewan said. "Didn't go out." Hamish's gaze drifted downward to Ewan's feet. Slippers, worn, soft-soled, damp around the edges as though recently dried. "Cold night for slippers," Hamish remarked lightly. Ewan stiffened. "I didn't step outside," he said too quickly. "Not once." Hamish smiled apologetically and changed the subject, but the denial lingered louder than a confession. As he left, he noticed a small clock on Ewan's mantelpiece, ticking steadily. Its face read 12 minutes past midnight. By the time dusk fell, Hamish had heard half a dozen versions of the same night, each slightly different, each carefully incomplete. Some villagers volunteered details no one had asked for. Others guarded their words as though they weighed too much to share. What united them all was the same quiet fear, the sense that something had happened in Loch Dhu that should have remained unspoken. Hamish walked alone along the track back toward Angus MacLeod's cottage, the sky darkening above him. Someone had visited that house on New Year's night. Someone had waited, spoken softly, and left without leaving footprints behind. And now, surrounded by voices that slipped and contradicted themselves, Hamish Macbeth knew the silence was not empty at all. It was crowded with lies. Hamish returned to the cottage as night fell, the soft hiss of snow underfoot marking each step along the track. The village was quiet now, the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums, heavy with suspicion and secrets. Inside, the empty chair where Angus had sat seemed almost accusatory in its stillness, as though daring anyone to speak the truth aloud. Hamish lit a small lamp, its warm glow revealing the fine details of the room he had already studied once. But now he looked not just for what had been left behind, but for what had been taken, or hidden. He began to map the web of relationships, starting with the villagers he had spoken to. Morag Mac Innes had seemed anxious, eager to clarify every detail, yet certain words and gestures suggested she knew more than she admitted. She had business dealings with Angus, selling supplies on commission, and Hamish noted the faint crease of a receipt in her coat pocket that might indicate recent transactions. That in itself was innocent, but when paired with the nervous glance she had shot toward the back window, it hinted at an untold connection. Donald Fraser at the pub was next. He had been quick to volunteer information, too quick to deflect when Hamish pressed him about Angus's supposed plans. Hamish considered the stories about past grievances between the men, arguments over grazing land, debts left unpaid, and the way Donald had been known to gamble heavily on New Year's night. Greed, perhaps, or fear of exposure. He also remembered Donald's nervous glance at the whisky glass when Hamish had mentioned it earlier, perhaps not at all concerned with Angus's death, but with what he had done or failed to do that evening. Ewan Campbell's slippers, damp and soft-soled, haunted Hamish's thoughts. A man who claimed not to leave his house all night, yet carried the faint trace of snow indoors, suggested more than carelessness. Ewan and Angus had been neighbours for decades, with shared land, arguments over fences, and grudges long simmering beneath polite conversation. Could a simple New Year's visit have turned fatal, or had Ewan been hiding his own involvement more subtly than anyone else? Then there were the subtler threads. Mrs. MacRae's hesitation, the slight tremor in her voice when she described discovering Angus, the way her eyes avoided certain corners of the room. She claimed to have found the body by chance, yet Hamish noted the absence of footprints that would have marked a rushed discovery. Was she covering for someone, or herself? And what of the mysterious scrap of paper pressed flat but blank, its invisible message hinting at a communication no one wanted revealed? As Hamish paced the cottage, a picture of intertwined motives began to take shape. Everyone had reasons, yet none had an airtight alibi. Greed laced through business dealings and unpaid debts. Revenge simmered beneath decades of neighbourly disputes. Jealousy had its place in personal grievances. And fear, the quietest yet most potent motive of all, pressed at the edges of every story. No one was wholly innocent, yet no single narrative could explain how Angus had died in his chair, in a room locked from the inside, leaving only a faint indentation in the snow outside, a stopped clock, and a whisper of a message on a blank scrap of paper. Hamish spread his mental map across the room, linking names and motives with invisible threads. Morag might have benefited from a hidden transaction. Donald had the recklessness to take advantage of the situation. Ewan had the quiet resentment and physical evidence suggesting he had moved unseen. And Mrs. MacRae, her motives were murky, perhaps protective of someone else, perhaps fearful of truths best left buried. Each thread alone explained part of the puzzle. Together, they formed a tangled maze that made the solution elusive. He returned to the hearth, absently turning the stopped clock over in his hands, feeling the precise, deliberate mechanism beneath its face. Just like the crime, thought Hamish. Precise, deliberate, and yet layered, designed to mislead. He considered the timing. Midnight, the hour when celebrations distracted everyone, when people's attention was at its most fragmented. Whoever had planned this had known exactly how to conceal their tracks. using the village itself as a shield. Hamish sat down, leaning back and letting the room's silence envelope him. He could feel the maze tightening, the individual motives overlapping, sometimes contradicting, sometimes converging. He would need to track each thread carefully, follow the lies until they led him to the truth. The trick was separating the noise, the alibis, the half-truths, the fear-driven confessions, from the reality hidden in plain sight. Somewhere in that web of greed, revenge, jealousy and fear lay the single action that had ended Angus MacLeod's life. And Hamish Macbeth, patient as always, knew the first breakthrough would come not from grand revelations, but from noticing the quietest, smallest inconsistencies, the ones everyone else had overlooked. Morning came with a thin, cold light that filtered through the frost-flecked windows of Loch-Dhu. Hamish Macbeth had spent the hours before dawn walking the tracks around the village, retracing the snow's subtle markings, thinking over every word he had heard, every glance he had noted, every half-truth whispered under the soft hum of New Year's quiet. When he returned to the cottage, the constable and a visiting officer from the neighbouring town were already there, bustling with purpose. They had found something, they said, something that would crack the case wide open. Hamish watched silently as the officers displayed the evidence, a small vial of powdered toxin tucked behind a loose brick in the hearth. They claimed it was enough to explain Angus MacLeod's sudden death, and the excitement in their eyes was almost comical. Poison, they declared triumphantly, clearly administered in the whiskey glass. Case closed. A wave of disbelief washed over the villagers gathered outside. Whispers and nods followed. Morag's lips pressed into a tight line. Donald Fraser's shoulders relaxed in relief. Ewan Campbell looked unconcerned, as though he had known all along. Mrs. MacRae clutched her shawl nervously, and Hamish kept his gaze fixed on the vial. He picked it up, turning it carefully between his fingers, studying the fine crystalline powder inside. It was unfamiliar, but not unusual enough to demand immediate attention. Hamish's eyes flicked back to the glass of whiskey still sitting on the table. He inhaled lightly. No trace of bitterness, no smell of chemical alteration. If the poison had been placed in the whiskey, he thought, the body should taste of it. He had seen enough deaths and near-deaths in his time to know subtle things, what was said, what was left unsaid. "Are you satisfied now?" the visiting officer asked, beaming. Hamish smiled faintly, a slow smile that reached only his eyes. "I'm always satisfied when the truth is clear," he said softly. He set the vial down carefully, not to disturb it, but inside unease churned. The vial, the sudden announcement, the triumphant declarations, it felt too convenient. Too tidy. He knew the signs of a false victory, the way a case could be wrapped up neatly while the real culprit watched from the shadows, counting on the premature relief of others. Hamish moved through the cottage once more, noting the alignment of the table, the untouched whiskey, the faint indentation near the window. None of it matched a rushed poisoning, not really. No hurried footsteps, no signs of struggle. The body had remained calm, composed, seated upright, as though expecting someone. And that scrap of paper, the faint impression of words still lurking beneath the surface, remained unexamined. He left the cottage briefly to observe the villagers' reactions. Morag MacInnes clutched her apron tightly, a habit she did not have, and her eyes darted too frequently to the side, catching someone's attention who might not be there. Donald Fraser had gone silent, avoiding Hamish's gaze. Ewan Campbell remained distant, but not worried, more amused than anything, as if he were privy to a secret others were missing. Even Mrs. MacRae seemed relieved, yet her hands fidgeted, restless. Back in the cottage, Hamish knelt by the chair, examining the subtle impressions on the floor and in the paper once more. A visitor had come, but who? And if poison had been involved, why had the body remained undisturbed in a chair, the whiskey untouched? Something did not align. The officers had a cause of death. Hamish had a scene that whispered a different story entirely. He leaned back, folding his hands over his knees. The false sense of closure in the air was almost suffocating, like a blanket smothering the truth beneath. Whoever had planned this was patient, meticulous, cunning enough to let the authorities claim a simple solution, while the real answer waited, invisible, just beyond their reach. Hamish glanced once more at the stopped clock, its face now ticking steadily after his earlier adjustment, and the blank scrap of paper lying on the table. He could feel it in his bones. The real criminal was still out there, watching, waiting. They would strike again if given the chance, confident that no one was paying close enough attention. The village, relieved and satisfied, had already begun to disperse. But Hamish Macbeth remained, silent and observant, knowing that the game was far from over. In the warmth of the cottage, in the false calm of the morning, the true danger lingered, hidden in plain sight. And he was certain of one thing: the next move would belong to the person who had been clever enough to set the trap and patient enough to wait, while everyone else believed it solved. Hamish stayed in the cottage long after the villagers had gone, letting the soft glow of the lamp illuminate corners he had not studied closely before. His eyes drifted to the small bookcase along the wall, dusty but orderly, and he noticed a thin volume tucked behind a row of more substantial tomes. Pulling it free, he saw it was a collection of old village court records, bound in leather and cracked with age. Angus MacLeod's handwriting marked several pages, careful notes about disputes, debts, and grievances stretching back decades. Hamish's interest sharpened immediately. Flipping through, he paused at one entry, a case from 30 years prior, involving a land dispute that had ended badly. The names jumped off the page. Donald Fraser had been involved, as had Ewan Campbell, though both were young men then. The record detailed arguments over grazing rights, with threats exchanged, minor injuries, and a settlement that had left both men bitter, though the official case had been quietly closed. Hamish leaned back, connecting dots he had not yet seen, old resentment simmering beneath the surface, ready to bubble up with the right provocation. He examined the faint impressions on the scrap of paper again, and a thought struck him. What if the visitor on New Year's night was not just any stranger, but someone enacting a slow, deliberate vengeance rooted in that old feud? The careful precision of the room, the untouched whiskey, the timing, all of it could have been designed to create fear and confusion rather than a direct attack. The poison vial was a convenient distraction, a red herring to mislead anyone searching for a simple solution. Hamish recalled the damp slippers of Ewan Campbell, the sudden eagerness of Donald Fraser, Morag MacInnes's nervous glances. At first they had seemed isolated quirks, minor inconsistencies, but now a pattern began to emerge. Everyone had been tied to Angus in some way for years, some with direct grievances, others through financial or social entanglements. The silent visitor, Hamish realized, may have exploited these hidden connections, knowing that the village itself would protect the deception with its collective assumptions and distractions. He closed the book and traced his fingers along the spine, thinking about the quiet way resentment can linger. A man wronged decades ago does not always forgive, and in Lochdu people tended to settle scores slowly, quietly, without grand gestures but with meticulous timing. Could the visitor have been someone who had waited years for the perfect moment, who understood the village and its people well enough to manipulate them without detection? Hamish rose and walked to the window, staring out over the snow-covered tracks. He considered Morag's business dealings, Donald's gambling habits, and Ewan's long-standing grudge. Perhaps they had not acted alone. Perhaps the real danger lay in a network of motives, each person aware of the others in ways that had remained hidden until now. The village was small, and old feuds intertwined, creating a web so tight that no one could see it all at once. He returned to the scrap of paper, holding it to the light with care. The faint indentations hinted at a message, and suddenly he understood that it was not just a note. It was a signal, a mark for someone who knew exactly what had transpired and what to do next. The visitor had left it intentionally, knowing it would be overlooked by everyone else but could guide an accomplice or manipulate the village's assumptions. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet thrill of discovery that came when the past and present collided. The murder, or perhaps the staged death, was not a simple act of violence but a carefully orchestrated performance, built upon the foundations of long-forgotten grievances. The past had never truly been resolved, it had only lain dormant, waiting for the right night to emerge. He knew now that the solution required more than examining the immediate scene or chasing the obvious clues. He would have to untangle decades of history, confront grudges long buried, and follow the invisible threads that connected Angus, Donald, Ewan and Morag in ways the villagers could never have imagined. The crime was rooted in the past, yet its consequences were playing out in the present, and only by tracing the shadows left behind could he hope to reveal the truth. Hamish sat back in the chair Angus had occupied, the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the wind whispered across the moor, carrying with it the quiet weight of memory and old resentments. Somewhere in Loch-Dhu, the true architect of the night's events waited, confident that the tangled web of the past would protect them, and Hamish Macbeth, patient and relentless, understood that he was now walking through history itself, searching for the single, hidden thread that could unravel the entire mystery. Hamish Macbeth returned to the village with the weight of the past pressing on his mind. But he knew that history alone would not unmask the silent visitor. The clues lay in the present, in reactions and small gestures, and he had learned that people often betrayed themselves without realizing it. By late afternoon, the villagers had settled into a tentative routine, believing the poison vial had closed the matter. Hamish took advantage of their false sense of security. He started with a simple, almost casual approach. At the shop, he engaged Morag Mac Innes in conversation, asking about mundane matters, her stock, deliveries, the weather. Then, without warning, he slipped in an unusual observation. "You must have noticed how quickly the snow melts near Angus's doorstep," he said, as though thinking aloud. "Odd how footprints vanish, isn't it? Even a single slip of a slipper leaves a mark, though, doesn't it?" Morag's hands, previously busy arranging shelves, stilled for a fraction of a second. Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the road, then back to Hamish with an effort at casual composure. Hamish did not press, only watched. Small cracks often appeared first as hesitation. Next he invited Donald Fraser for a walk along the frozen tracks, ostensibly to discuss routine village matters. They moved slowly, the moor stretching in white silence around them. Hamish let the conversation drift toward old feuds, old arguments, and the unspoken grudges that persisted through decades. Donald laughed at first, the sound too loud, too forced, as if masking discomfort. Hamish mentioned the grazing dispute from 30 years prior, detailing it almost abstractly, as though reading it from a book. Donald's laughter faltered. I don't see why you bring that up now," he said quickly. He tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his voice carried a trace of tension, a subtle edge Hamish had learned to notice long ago. The crucial move came when Hamish suggested something seemingly trivial, a memory exercise. "Let's try this," he said gently. "Think back to New Year's Eve. I want you to recount the night as carefully as possible, including details you might not consider important. What you saw, what you heard, even small, ordinary things." He framed it as a test of memory, an almost scientific method, noting that subtle cues often revealed truths hidden behind deliberate lies. Donald complied, hesitating occasionally, correcting himself with unnecessary detail, repeating the same gestures in slightly different ways. Hamish observed every twitch of an eye, every shift of weight, every pause that betrayed discomfort. When Donald described hearing footsteps across the moor, Hamish's attention sharpened. He asked casually, which way did they go? Donald's gaze dropped to the snow beneath their feet, then back up with a too smooth answer, away from the cottage. Didn't see anyone, really. Hamish smiled faintly, letting the silence stretch. It's fascinating, he said softly. Sometimes what we think we didn't see reveals everything. A slippered footstep, a window left slightly ajar, a light left on. They all speak to us if we only pay attention. It was the moment of hesitation, the microsecond when Donald's composure faltered, that confirmed Hamish's suspicion. He noted it silently, storing it alongside the past grievances, the hidden connections, the false victory of the poisoned vial. This was not a confession, not yet, but it was a crack in the armour, a subtle indication that the carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. Hamish employed the same tactic later with Morag and Ewan, using indirect prompts and casual observations to test their reactions. Each showed hints of unease, subtle shifts in posture, averted eyes, or unnecessary clarifications, but none of them spoke freely. The trick was not to force the truth, but to let it emerge naturally, to allow human nature to betray itself in small, uncontrollable ways. By nightfall, Hamish returned to the cottage alone, reviewing what he had observed. The unconventional clue was not a physical object, but the behaviour itself, the hesitation, the overcompensation, the tiny contradictions that revealed knowledge, guilt, or fear. The silent visitor had left a trail, not through footprints or fingerprints, but through the way people reacted when the past was invoked, when the present was questioned with precision, when the mind was nudged toward its own secrets. Hamish sat once more in Angus's chair, considering the unfolding picture. The web was intricate, woven through years of resentment and opportunity. The unusual tactic had begun to expose its edges. Somewhere in the village, the person who had orchestrated the night's events had glimpsed Hamish's patience and insight, perhaps unaware that their careful disguise was starting to unravel, and Hamish knew, with quiet certainty, that the next moment would bring the truth closer, or force the perpetrator into a move they could not fully control. Hamish awoke the next morning to a sharp wind rattling the windows of his small flat above the village. The moor outside lay stark and white, under a pale winter sun, but inside, he sensed the first tremor of unease that comes when a hidden adversary is aware you are closing in. He had spent the night reviewing the mental map he had begun to construct, old grudges, hidden motives, subtle cracks in behaviour, and the invisible thread linking everyone to Angus MacLeod's final evening. He had felt the investigation gaining momentum, the faint pulse of discovery quickening, but momentum, he knew, could be fragile. By mid-morning, the constable arrived, fidgeting and pale. "Hamish, you'll want to see this," he said, barely able to contain himself. Hamish followed, the snow crunching underfoot, and entered the cottage. His heart sank at once. The scrap of paper, the very clue he had studied with care, was gone. Not merely missing, it had been cut from the book entirely, leaving only a jagged tear in the fibres of the table's surface beneath it. The clock on the mantelpiece had been shifted slightly, its minute hand now resting 2 minutes ahead of where it had been stopped, and the small vial of powdered toxin, the so-called breakthrough, had vanished from the hearth as if it had never existed. Hamish's eyes narrowed. This was no accident. The evidence had been deliberately removed, altered or destroyed, a direct attempt to derail the investigation. Someone knew that he was piecing the puzzle together and had acted to bury the truth before it could be revealed. He crouched by the table, scanning the floor. The snow outside, untouched in most areas, revealed a single, faint set of footprints leading from the back door to the moor, shallow and precise, almost as if the intruder had moved with deliberate care to avoid detection. Hamish traced them with his gloved hand, memorizing the pattern. Slippers, soft soles. Too small for Donald, too light for Ewan. Morag's shoes? Perhaps. Or someone else entirely, someone clever enough to manipulate every step. The constable shook his head. I don't understand. Who would— Someone who knows this village intimately, Hamish said softly, and someone who understands exactly what evidence could change how people see the night. He rose, pacing slowly. They've taken the scrap of paper and the vial, perhaps to suggest the poison was irrelevant, perhaps to hide the true sequence of events. Either way, they are confident that by removing these pieces, they can confuse or mislead. Hamish moved to the bookcase and examined the space where the old court records had been. Nothing else seemed disturbed, yet a faint scent lingered, peat smoke, mingled with a sharper chemical note, like disinfectant. Someone had handled the evidence and cleaned the surface afterward. A precaution or a taunt. The villagers began to gather outside again, murmuring anxiously when they noticed the cottage activity. Hamish intercepted Morag first. "Did anyone come in here overnight?" he asked gently. Morag's eyes widened, though she recovered quickly. No one, Hamish. I've been here, minding my shop." Her hands gripped her coat as if to prove her innocence. Hamish said nothing, only observed the subtle tension in her posture, the slight quickness in her breath, the almost imperceptible twitch of her left eye. He turned next to Ewan Campbell, who had appeared at the doorway, looking curious but calm. "The cottage hasn't been disturbed," Ewan said smoothly. "Nothing missing, nothing broken." Hamish raised an eyebrow, noting the faint smudge of dirt on Ewan's cuff. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Because someone has been here." Ewan's expression remained steady, yet Hamish detected the microshift in his shoulders, the quick tightening of his jaw. A subtle reaction, but enough. By noon, Hamish realized that the removal of the evidence had changed the entire rhythm of the investigation. The false confidence of the police, the village's assumption of a simple solution, and even the behaviours of the suspects themselves would all be manipulated by this act. Whoever had stolen or destroyed the paper and vial had intimate knowledge of not just the crime, but of Hamish's methods, and had acted strategically to delay discovery. He retreated to the corner of the cottage, sitting in the chair Angus had once occupied, allowing the quiet to settle around him. The footprints, the torn edge of the table, the faint chemical scent, all were clues in themselves, unconventional but deliberate. Someone was clever, patient and confident, playing a long game. Hamish's mind raced, linking each observation to the web of motives he had begun to untangle. The vanishing evidence was not just an obstacle, it was a message. The real criminal was aware, watching, and ready to act again if provoked. Trust in the village had become a fragile thing, and the detective understood that the next move had to be as patient, as calculated, and as subtle as the unseen hand that had just tried to bury the truth. Outside, the wind moaned across the moor, carrying with it a warning that the night's shadows were far from dispersed, and Hamish Macbeth, resolute and observant, knew that the game had escalated. The perpetrator was no longer hiding, but actively shaping the investigation from the darkness, daring him to follow. Hamish Macbeth had barely begun to piece together the implications of the vanishing evidence when the first urgent knock came at his door. The constable, breathless and wide-eyed, barely managed to speak. "Hamish, you need to come. It's happened again." The cold wind bit as they raced across the village to the MacLeod family's old boathouse at the edge of the loch. Hamish's mind worked furiously, trying to anticipate what he might find, already calculating the pattern of the unseen hand that had been manipulating the investigation. But nothing could have prepared him for the scene. Inside, the air smelled of peat smoke and damp wood, a smell familiar from many long nights walking the moor. Yet now it was mingled with the acrid tang of fear. Ewan Campbell lay on the floor unconscious. a deep bruise darkening one temple. A chair had been overturned, its legs splintered against the flagstone floor, and a single slippered footprint led out through the side door and toward the moor, leaving a faint trail in the snow. There were no other signs of struggle, no forced entry, no blood, just the subtle chaos left behind by a carefully executed attack. Hamish knelt beside Ewan, gently checking for injuries beyond the obvious. He felt the rapid pulse, shallow and frightened. Ewan stirred, groaning, and opened his eyes just enough to meet Hamish's. It was him, Ewan whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. The visitor. He warned me. Warned you. Hamish pressed, keeping his tone calm, steady. He noted the precise bruise on Ewan's temple, the angle of the fall, the way the slippered footprint had been left deliberately to be noticed, or perhaps to mislead. Yes, Ewan said, his words fragmented. I knew they were watching. I shouldn't have said anything. He struggled to sit up. They know you're close. Hamish's mind clicked. The vanishing evidence, the carefully orchestrated web of deception, the subtle cracks in behaviour, all pointed to someone who was not only clever but bold, someone willing to escalate when Hamish approached the truth too closely. This attack was a warning, a message that the silent visitor, or those allied with them, were still several steps ahead, shaping events to their own advantage. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed except for the faint tracks Hamish had already noted, the ones that suggested soft-soled shoes and careful timing. The perpetrator had struck swiftly, targeted a specific person connected to the investigation, and vanished as if carried by the wind itself. Whoever it was, they had anticipated Hamish's movements, or at least the general trajectory of his inquiries. Hamish helped Ewan to a nearby chair, supporting him as the constable called for medical assistance. His eyes scanned the room and then the trail outside, tracing the path to the moor. The footprint ended abruptly near a small rise, a deliberate choice, likely to obscure direction and to taunt any pursuers. Hamish noted the precision, the patience, the audacity. This was no random act of violence. This was strategy. As he stood and walked toward the doorway, he considered the implications. The original death, the vanishing evidence, the subtle behavioral cues. Everything was connected, orchestrated by someone who knew the village intimately, who understood human nature, and who could manipulate it with terrifying skill. And now the game had shifted. Hamish was no longer merely following clues, he was being drawn into the villain's plan, forced to anticipate attacks that had not yet occurred. Ewan, still shaking, whispered a final warning. Hamish, it's not just the past or the grudges. It's someone who wants to control how the story ends. They're not finished. Hamish nodded, his pale eyes narrowing with resolve. The silent visitor was no longer a passive figure in the shadows. They had become active, dangerous, and unpredictable. If he was to solve the mystery and prevent further harm, Hamish would have to think several steps ahead, anticipate moves before they were made, and confront a mind that had already been playing chess while the village slept. The moor outside was empty, white and still. Yet Hamish could feel the invisible presence watching, waiting, confident that they had drawn first blood in the next stage of the deadly game. And Hamish Macbeth, patient and relentless, understood that the investigation had transformed into a race, not just to uncover the truth, but to prevent the silent visitor from striking again. Hamish Macbeth returned to the village after ensuring Ewan was safe and being attended to. The moor outside stretched in a pale, quiet expanse, deceptively serene. Yet Hamish felt the subtle tension in the air, the knowledge that the silent visitor had not finished playing. As he walked slowly through the village, observing the lingering anxiety in every eye, a small, almost trivial detail began to nudge at the edges of his mind, the way Morag Mac Innes always arranged her stock in the shop. The slight tilt of a bottle or a jar shifted just so, as though following a rhythm only she understood. It had seemed insignificant at first, mere habit, but now, in the context of everything else, it suggested a pattern of meticulous control, an obsession with precision. Hamish recalled the tiny smudge on Ewan's cuff, the slippered footprints in the snow, the angle at which the scrap of paper had been torn from the table, and the way the clock on the mantelpiece had been moved. Each instance seemed minor on its own, but together they revealed a signature, a careful, deliberate arrangement that left a trail only visible to a careful observer. He returned to the cottage and studied the chair Angus had occupied. The faint impressions in the wooden floorboards, barely visible, suggested not just weight but the rhythm of movement, subtle shifts, slight inclinations, almost like someone had practiced each placement in advance. The invisible choreography of a visitor, Hamish realized, left behind not just traces of presence but traces of intention. The visitor's method was consistent, precise, almost obsessively neat. The scrap of paper now made sense in a new way. The faint impressions, the subtle folds, the fact that it had been cut and vanished, all were part of the pattern. Whoever had written on it and removed it had been deliberately sending signals to those who understood the context, manipulating not just the villagers, but anyone who might try to read between the lines. Hamish could almost see the thought process, small, deliberate distractions designed to obscure the real truth while leaving breadcrumbs for someone patient enough to notice. He thought of the previous interviews, the hesitant glances, the slight contradictions in each suspect's story, Donald Fraser's nervous over-elaboration, Morag's anxious postures, Ewan's calculated calm. Each behaviour now seemed like a calculated response to an unseen pressure, a pressure exerted by someone who knew how to exploit the tiniest detail. Even Mrs. Macrae's hesitation, once attributed to shock, fit the emerging rhythm. Everyone had reacted not to a single act, but to a carefully orchestrated sequence, and the sequence itself revealed the invisible hand guiding events. Hamish crouched beside the hearth and let his gaze drift over the empty table, imagining the arrangement of objects during the critical hours of the night. The whisky glass, untouched yet freshly poured, the faintly crooked chair, the careful placement of books and trinkets, all spoke to a mind attentive to minutiae, someone who could manipulate a scene with such subtlety that it would appear normal to anyone unobservant. The pattern was there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone meticulous enough to notice. He stepped outside, the cold wind biting at his cheeks, and traced the faint footprints leading toward the moor once again. The direction, the spacing, the careful avoidance of snowdrifts, all now formed coherent sequence. The visitor had been deliberate in every move, precise in every action, leaving a trail that only revealed itself when one understood the logic underlying the chaos. Hamish realized the brilliance of it. The perpetrator had assumed that the small, ordinary details would be dismissed, that they would blend seamlessly into the village's daily rhythm, and only a mind trained to see patterns could reconstruct the sequence. Sitting in the quiet of the empty cottage, Hamish pieced together the connections in his mind. The grievances of the past, the subtle behavioural cues, the vanishing evidence, the attack on Ewan, all were part of the same pattern, a deliberate orchestration designed to mislead and manipulate. And now, seeing the pattern clearly, Hamish understood that the key had always been in the details the village had overlooked, the rhythm of movement, the minutiae of human behaviour, the obsessive neatness of a carefully controlled environment. The silent visitor, he realized, had been communicating not just through words or actions, but through patterns. Patterns in the environment, patterns in the reactions of others, patterns in the chaos that appeared random. And it was precisely this understanding, the recognition of the invisible order behind the disorder, that would allow Hamish Macbeth to anticipate the next move, to predict the unseen, and to finally bring the elusive truth to light. Hamish Macbeth spent the following evening in quiet reflection, revisiting the village in his mind and tracing the delicate threads he had begun to see in the pattern of events. The snow lay thick across the moor, each print, each indentation a silent message to those patient enough to read it. The pieces were coming together, but one crucial element remained obscured: the motive. Greed, revenge, jealousy. They explained some behaviors, but they did not account for the precision, the obsession with control, the relentless orchestration of misdirection. The crime had a depth beyond ordinary human quarrels. He returned to Angus MacLeod's cottage, now cleared of the chaos but still resonant with the invisible tension left behind. Hamish moved methodically, examining the small details he had overlooked in the rush of the investigation, the careful alignment of objects on shelves, the subtle wear on the floorboards where chairs had been dragged countless times, the faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the table near where the scrap of paper had been torn. These were the marks of someone who valued not just the act itself, but the story it told. Then it clicked. A memory from the old court records surfaced, an entry Angus had made about a local family feud, dismissed at the time as inconsequential, noting in meticulous detail the psychological toll it had taken on certain individuals. Hamish realized that the visitor's actions were not merely revenge for an old grievance, nor a simple financial ploy. They were about restoring a sense of narrative, a control over history itself. The villain had perceived themselves as wronged for decades, but their vendetta was deeply personal, extending beyond what anyone else would consider justifiable. Hamish's thoughts turned to Morag MacInnes, Donald Fraser, and Ewan Campbell. Their behaviours now aligned perfectly with this psychological framework. Morag's obsessive habits, her careful attention to the shop and the minutiae of the village, were not mere quirks. They reflected a desire to impose order on a world that had once humiliated or disappointed her. Donald's nervous overstatements, the way he corrected himself unnecessarily, revealed a man who had long been overshadowed, struggling to assert control in moments where he could manipulate perception, and Ewan, with his calm detachment and precise movements, had cultivated patience over decades, waiting for the exact moment to reshape events according to a vision only he could understand. Hamish felt the puzzle shift in his mind. The crime had never been about a single act of violence or a straightforward misdeed. It had been a performance, a manifestation of long-held psychological need. The poisoning, the vanishing evidence, the staged attack, all were instruments in a carefully rehearsed narrative designed to assert dominance over the village, to manipulate its perception, to rewrite history in the mind of the perpetrator. Each step had been deliberate, each detail meticulously planned, because the villain needed the world to recognize their intellect, their control, and their subtle revenge, not merely the outcome of a crime. He returned to the scrap of paper that had been recovered, examining the faint impressions that remained. The words were secondary. It was the act of leaving it, carefully folded and marked, that revealed intent. It was a signature of obsession, a statement that this was not random, that the crime itself was a reflection of the inner workings of the mind responsible. Hamish understood now that the danger was not only in what had been done, but in what the perpetrator believed they could control next: the village, the narrative, the very flow of discovery. Hamish felt the weight of realization settle over him. The crime's motive was rooted in psychological obsession, a compulsion that demanded not only the elimination of the victim, but the orchestration of the scene, the manipulation of others, the creation of a story that aligned with the villain's self-image. It was far more shocking than money, power, or simple revenge. It was about identity, mastery, and the need to craft a reality in which the perpetrator was supreme, unseen but omnipotent. Outside, the wind whispered across the moor, carrying the quiet echo of decades-old grudges, subtle and enduring. Hamish leaned against the window frame, thinking of the patient, methodical mind that had orchestrated everything, and he knew that understanding the motive was only the first step. The mind behind these events would act again if allowed, and the deeper the psychological need, the more extreme the lengths the villain would go to maintain control. Hamish Macbeth, aware now of the full depth of the crime's motive, felt the familiar sharpening of focus, the certainty that insight into the mind of the perpetrator would guide the next move. The true battle was no longer merely one of evidence and alibis. It was a confrontation with a human psyche meticulously honed over decades, capable of cruelty, manipulation, and the silent satisfaction of seeing a plan unfold exactly as imagined. And Hamish, patient and steady, began to formulate the approach that would finally bring the hidden truth into the open. Hamish Macbeth spent the next morning moving deliberately through the village, making quiet observations, noting subtle patterns, and gauging the reactions of those around him. Every glance, every hesitation, every repeated phrase fed into the mental map he had constructed over weeks of careful scrutiny. The web of grudges, motives, and psychological precision was complete, and he now knew exactly how to draw the silent visitor into the open. He did not rush. Hamish understood that patience, not force, would be the key to the final confrontation. By late afternoon, he had orchestrated the perfect scenario. A small gathering of villagers was convened in Angus MacLeod's cleared cottage, under the pretense of reviewing the sequence of events in the hope of providing closure. The room was warm, the light falling softly across familiar objects, yet Hamish arranged each detail meticulously. The chair slightly askew, the books on the shelf deliberately out of line, the clock on the mantel ticking 2 minutes fast, just as it had been shifted before. Each element was chosen to draw out the culprit, to exploit the patterns of behavior that had revealed the villain's obsessive nature. He allowed the conversation to drift casually, inviting commentary on minor details, letting people correct themselves, reveal hidden reactions, and inadvertently betray concern. Morag Mac Innes fiddled with a shawl, her eyes darting toward a corner of the room as if expecting something. Donald Fraser repeated a story about the night of the crime, over-explaining the sequence of events just as Hamish had observed before. Ewan Campbell remained still, calm, his composure a mask that had once concealed the subtle movements Hamish had traced on the snow. And then he waited. Hamish leaned lightly against the table, his pale eyes steady and quiet, giving nothing away. "It's fascinating," he said softly, "how the smallest details can betray the greatest intentions, the rhythm of a person's movements, the micro-gestures that seem insignificant. They tell a story that words alone cannot." He allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of observation press upon the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, a figure shifted. Morag Mac Innes's hand trembled as she reached for a book, knocking it askew deliberately, but not carelessly. Her eyes met Hamish's for a brief second, sharp and calculating. The precise moment of recognition passed, and in that instant Hamish knew. The obsession, the need to control, the careful orchestration of minutiae, it all pointed to her. "You've been very careful," Hamish said quietly, addressing the room but focusing on her. "Patient, meticulous, confident that no one would notice the little patterns you left behind. But people do notice. They always notice if they're paying attention." Morag froze, her breath caught in her throat. Hamish continued, his tone calm, almost conversational. "The poisoning, the disappearing evidence, the attack on Ewan, each act designed to manipulate perception, to create a story where you controlled the narrative completely. Every small detail was intentional, every misdirection deliberate. And yet—" He let the pause stretch, giving her a moment to confront the inevitability of exposure. The patterns always speak louder than words, and patterns never lie. Her face paled, and for the first time, the carefully maintained composure cracked. I didn't mean," she began, her voice trembling. She faltered, glanced toward the door, as if considering flight. But the weight of the room, of Hamish's unwavering gaze, pinned her in place. "You intended to orchestrate everything perfectly," Hamish said softly. "To correct the past wrongs in a way only you could see as justice. But the cost, it has been too high." He gestured lightly toward the missing evidence and the damaged scenes. "Your plan required control over not just events but perception itself, yet in doing so you underestimated patience, observation, and the power of subtle truth." For a long, tense moment, Morag's eyes darted, her lips pressed tight. Then finally the admission came, a whisper, reluctant but unmistakable. I wanted them to see, to understand, to respect what was rightfully mine. And Angus, he wouldn't let it go, not even after all those years." Her shoulders sagged, the tension leaving her body in a slow, resigned exhale. Hamish remained calm, steady, as the constable quietly moved forward to ensure she could do no harm, the villagers watching with a mixture of shock and relief. The silent visitor had been unmasked, not through force, not through intimidation, but through patient observation, the careful study of patterns, and the subtle unravelling of human psychology. The room settled into a hushed silence. Hamish Macbeth, having pieced together the motive, the method, and the manipulations, finally allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. The intricate web of obsession, control, and long-buried resentment had been exposed, and the danger that had loomed over Loch Dhu was at last contained. The mystery was solved, not by rushing to conclusions, but by seeing what had always been in plain sight for those willing to notice. Hamish Macbeth had just begun to relax, feeling the tension of weeks of observation and deduction lift slightly now that Morag Mac Innes had confessed. The villagers, still murmuring among themselves, seemed to accept the resolution. The constable was busy writing up notes, satisfied that the case had finally reached closure. Hamish, however, remained in the corner of the cottage, his pale eyes scanning, never fully at ease. He had learned over the years that in Loch Dhu appearances could be deceiving, and nothing, no confession, no neat resolution, ever fully guaranteed the truth. It was a faint detail that first caught his attention, a ledger left carelessly on a side table, open to a page Morag had not thought to conceal. Hamish's trained eyes scanned the neat handwriting, the rows of figures and annotations. At first it seemed trivial, a record of minor shop transactions, but then he noticed something odd, a series of coded entries, tiny symbols tucked into the margins, repeated over weeks and months. They didn't match Morag's patterns, not the obsessive neatness he had identified. These marks were deliberate, precise in a way that suggested a different mind entirely. Hamish's pulse quickened. He had been so focused on the patterns he had traced, so convinced he understood the mind behind the crimes, that he had overlooked the possibility of a second hand, a silent collaborator, someone who had orchestrated events behind Morag's apparent obsession. He ran through the events in his mind, the vanishing evidence, the attack on Ewan, the subtle misdirections, the careful exploitation of old grudges. Everything Morag had confessed to now seemed like part of a larger design. He called Ewan and Donald back into the cottage, feigning calm curiosity. "There's something I've noticed," he said softly, drawing their attention to the ledger. "I believe someone else has been guiding the story, quietly shaping events, while we focused on the obvious." Ewan's eyes narrowed, Donald's jaw tightened, and both looked momentarily puzzled, as if they hadn't considered that the resolution might be incomplete. Hamish explained carefully, tracing the coded entries in the margins, highlighting subtle correlations between the symbols and key moments of the crime. Each mark corresponded to an action, a distraction, a move designed to manipulate perception. Whoever had done this was invisible, patient, and operating on a level far beyond Morag's personal obsession. He looked toward the window, toward the moor beyond, where the wind rustled across the snow. Then it hit him. The subtle inconsistencies he had noted in Ewan's behavior, the precise, almost theatrical way he had positioned himself during the earlier questioning, the faint smudge on his cuff during the incident at the boathouse. Suddenly, the pieces aligned in a way that could not be ignored. Ewan Campbell had been orchestrating events from the shadows, guiding Morag's actions, ensuring that the sequence unfolded according to a plan he had conceived long ago. Hamish felt the familiar tightening of focus. He stood, calm but resolute, and addressed Ewan directly. "I believe you have been the invisible hand behind all of this. You allowed Morag to act, to take the blame, to confess, while you remained safely concealed. Every subtle cue, every hesitation, every micro-gesture we observed, they were part of your orchestration." Ewan's composure faltered for the first time. His eyes, which had always seemed so calm, now betrayed a flicker of surprise. I didn't expect you would notice," he stammered, voice low. A faint smirk tried to emerge, but Hamish's gaze held him in place, sharp and unwavering. "Yes," Hamish said softly, walking closer. "You are clever, patient, meticulous. But you underestimated the power of observation, of patience, and of noticing the patterns no one else can see. The true mastermind cannot hide forever, even behind another's obsession." The room held a charged silence. Ewan's mind raced, calculating escape, deflection, argument, but Hamish's insight, his methodical unravelling of motive and method, had trapped him psychologically. There was no sudden confession, no dramatic gesture, only the slow recognition of exposure. His plan, flawless in execution, had finally encountered someone willing and able to see the invisible thread connecting every action. Ewan's shoulders slumped, the carefully cultivated calm draining away. Hamish's words had stripped the control from him, revealing the complexity beneath the surface. The case, which had seemed resolved only moments before, now revealed a final, unexpected twist. The silent visitor, the orchestrator of chaos and subtle terror, had been someone no one suspected, a mind operating in the shadows, manipulating the apparent culprit with precision. Hamish Macbeth, standing tall and patient, allowed the realization to settle over the room. The mastermind was unmasked, the hidden motives laid bare, and the final layer of deception revealed. The village of Lochdu, quiet once more, would soon awaken to the truth that danger had never been fully visible, and that justice, subtle and exacting, had required the calm patience and keen perception of the one man who had seen it all. The cottage felt heavy with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the distant whisper of wind across the moor. Ewan Campbell stood frozen, caught between defiance and the slow realization that the web he had spun was finally unravelling. Hamish Macbeth observed him carefully, noting the subtle tremor in his hand and the way his eyes darted toward the window, measuring the distance to freedom or to capture. Justice, Hamish knew, could take many forms, but the truth always demanded acknowledgement. Slowly, Hamish began to explain, his voice calm and precise. You see, the sequence of events was never random. The vanishing vial, the torn scrap of paper, the attack on Ewan, all were designed to mislead, to give the impression of chaos while you directed the flow from behind the scenes. The microgestures, the inconsistencies in behaviour, the tiny adjustments in posture and speech, they were all indicators of manipulation. Most people would have dismissed them as nervousness or habit, but patterns never lie. Ewan's face tightened, And Morag, she took the fall? Exactly, Hamish said, nodding. She was your instrument, guided by your subtle cues, your understanding of the village and its history. You exploited her obsessive need for order to orchestrate a narrative that you thought would protect you. Yet, even the most patient hand leaves a trace, if one knows where to look. Hamish gestured to the ledger on the table, the coded symbols in the margins. These were your final signature, tiny marks inconspicuous to anyone else, mapping your orchestration step by step. You underestimated observation. Ewan's gaze dropped, and for a long moment the room seemed suspended in tension. Then, almost imperceptibly, he straightened and allowed the faintest smirk to curl his lips. "You've seen it all, Hamish," he said softly, almost admiringly. "And yet, you can't stop what's already set in motion." Before Hamish could respond, Ewan stepped toward the window. In a flash, he had unlatched it and was gone, leaving only the faint echoes of his boots across the snow and the whisper of wind over the moor. The villagers gasped, the constable shouted, but it was too late. The true villain had vanished into the night, leaving behind confession, evidence, and a trail of uncertainty. Justice, in the traditional sense, would have to wait. Hamish did not move immediately. He studied the footprints, the faint impressions left by Ewan's escape, and the careful way he had avoided leaving more than minimal traces. Even in retreat, the villain's methodical nature persisted. Hamish sighed softly, a mixture of frustration and admiration settling over him. The mind behind the crimes had been brilliant, patient, and relentless. He had escaped the confines of immediate law, but Hamish understood the deeper truth. Exposure and understanding were victories of a different kind. Turning to the villagers, Hamish explained the hidden clues that had gone unnoticed. The vanishing evidence was not merely theft, it was a message, a manipulation. The attack on Ewan was a staged signal to observe reactions. The coded entries in the ledger, subtle as they were, mapped the entire orchestration. Morag's behaviour, Donald's nervous repetition, and even the micro-gestures of others, they were all pieces of a puzzle that, together, revealed the invisible hand. The villagers listened, some with relief, others with disbelief, as Hamish traced the trail of observation and deduction. The crime was never about simple revenge or greed, he said, eyes glinting with certainty. It was about control, about narrative, about the meticulous exercise of intellect over chaos. And though Ewan has escaped physically, he cannot escape the exposure of his mind. The truth, once seen, cannot be erased. He paused, letting the wind carry the weight of his words. Outside, the snow shimmered under the cold moonlight, covering the footprints of the fleeing villain, but leaving the impressions in the consciousness of the village forever. Hamish understood that in Lochdu, justice was sometimes delayed, sometimes incomplete, but understanding, insight, and the exposure of deception were victories of their own kind. As the constable began recording the final observations, Hamish leaned against the table, his gaze returning to the now empty ledger. The patterns were always there, he murmured, in plain sight, if only someone cared to notice. That is why one step ahead is never just cleverness. It is attentiveness, patience, and the willingness to see what others dismiss as trivial. And with that, Hamish Macbeth stepped out into the cold night, the moor stretching before him, knowing that the silent visitor had slipped through his grasp, but that the truth of their methods, and the lesson of vigilance, would linger far longer than any fleeting escape. Hamish Macbeth stepped out into the chill night, the moon hanging low over the moor and casting silver light across the fresh snow. The village lay quiet behind him, the cottages dark except for a few stubborn lanterns, their warm glow faint against the vast open whiteness of the landscape. The wind whispered through the heather and over the frozen loch, carrying with it a sense of emptiness, and yet, as always, there was something lingering, something unspoken that clung to the edges of perception. He walked slowly, each footfall soft on the crusted snow, replaying the events of the past days in his mind. Morag's confession, Ewan's escape, the vanishing evidence, the coded ledger, it all fit together now, a tapestry of motives, obsessions, and human frailty. The case had been resolved in part, justice had been acknowledged, and yet, as Hamish moved farther from the village, a subtle unease settled over him. The patterns, the obsessions, the careful orchestration, they had revealed a mind brilliant and dangerous, but there was one detail that refused to settle. It was the scrap of paper, the one that had been torn from Angus's table and vanished, only to be partially recovered later. Hamish had examined it countless times, noting the subtle impressions, the faint traces of handwriting, the odd tilt of the letters. Something about it had always seemed slightly off, a nuance too deliberate, a message hidden beneath the surface. Now, as he walked along the moor, he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded it once more. There, almost invisible in the margin, was a tiny symbol he had overlooked before. A simple curve, a mark that did not match Morag's style, a signature that whispered of someone else entirely. Hamish's brow furrowed. The symbol suggested a connection he had not accounted for, a collaborator perhaps, someone who had influenced events even before Ewan had stepped fully into the shadows. It was a trace, barely perceptible, yet impossible to ignore. He felt the familiar tug of curiosity, that slow, persistent itch that had driven him to uncover so many mysteries in the past. It was the knowledge that even in the clarity of revelation, something else might be waiting just beyond perception. As he climbed the ridge overlooking the village, Hamish paused and looked back. The cottages slept, their chimneys sending faint plumes of smoke into the cold air. The footprints across the snow told a story, but there were gaps, traces that belonged to no one he had seen, impressions faint enough to vanish under a careful observer's eye. A shadow of uncertainty lingered, a reminder that the moor held more secrets than even the keenest detective could fully uncover in one case. He folded the scrap of paper carefully, tucking it back into his coat. Justice had been served as far as the village could understand, yet the knowledge of the unseen manipulations, the lingering signatures of the mastermind, and the tiny anomalies still scattered across the landscape, left a quiet tension in the air. Hamish knew the game was never truly over. In Lochdu, as elsewhere, a mind skilled in concealment could always return, reshaping events with patience, precision, and subtlety. A lone owl hooted somewhere in the distance, its call echoing across the empty moor, and Hamish allowed himself a faint smile. There would always be patterns to decipher, puzzles to unravel, and the unseen threads that connected human actions in ways most people overlooked. Each case left traces, and each trace promised the possibility of another story, another challenge to his patience and observation. As he began the long walk back toward the outskirts of the village, the wind carrying the faint scent of peat and frost, he thought of the silent visitor, the footprints, and the cryptic marks that remained. For a fleeting moment he allowed himself to imagine the mind behind them, watching from afar, confident that their work was not yet done. Hamish's steps slowed, his mind already tracing possibilities, anticipating what might come next. The case was concluded for now, but the moor, the village, and the human heart were rarely so simple, and so, with the village fading behind him and the moor stretching endless before him, Hamish Macbeth walked on into the quiet night, aware that while one mystery had ended, another always waited. Some secrets, he knew, would never be fully revealed, and some patterns, though glimpsed, would always hint at deeper, darker intricacies hidden just out of reach. The detective's gaze lingered on the horizon, a subtle spark of anticipation lighting his pale eyes, for in Lochdu a mystery never truly ends. It only pauses, waiting for the next curious mind to follow its trail.